My name is Julian Vance. I am 42 years old, and for 15 years I built an agency that secured encrypted financial data across 4 continents without suffering breaches, without violating regulations, and without ever begging anyone in my family for help. I constructed it from a tiny basement, a refurbished computer, and a mobile device with a shattered display. By the time they took it from me, the enterprise was appraised at nearly $7 million. They executed this during supper beneath crystal lighting with cheerful expressions and pressed linens as if they were delivering a festive speech rather than a corporate assassination. My father pushed a velvet binder over the surface. My brother unsealed it. I spotted the ownership documents before anyone uttered a sound. Then my father raised his beverage and declared that I had borne the weight long enough and it was time my brother received security. Diners nearby applauded because they assumed it was a wholesome generational handover. My mother relaxed in her seat, stared directly at my face, and insisted I would remain employed underneath him, since he deserved a stable future for his growing family. My brother did not object. He did not even appear ashamed. He simply rested his palm upon the binder as though it had perpetually belonged to him. I chuckled softly because that was the solitary barrier preventing a spectacle that would have concluded with shattered glass and bouncers arriving. Then I agreed silently, rose to my feet, and tucked my seat in so precisely that they all assumed I had surrendered. I certainly had not. I was finished completely. Before I reveal what my mother mentioned next and what occurred after I departed, please tell me what the current hour is wherever you are, and from which location are you tuning in today. I am genuinely interested to discover how far this narrative will reach. The second I exited that restaurant in central Manhattan, the freezing breeze felt purer than anything indoors. I lingered beneath the canopy for perhaps 5 moments, still catching the cheers through the walls, and recognized something horrific yet liberating simultaneously. They had not merely seized a corporation from my grasp. They had removed the final justification I continuously utilized to remain faithful to relatives who were never faithful to me. I marched 4 streets in formal shoes that tortured my soles and arrived at an all-night cafeteria opposite a clinic, the sort with scorched brews, glowing lights reflecting on windows, and servers who avoid inquiring when a man takes a booth, looking like he might shatter completely. That was precisely where I phoned Marcus Thorne, the single individual who witnessed the true foundation of my operation throughout the decades, and never treated my achievements as communal wealth. He arrived, sporting a heavy jacket over gym clothes, having just completed a delayed workout session, slipped into the seat, examined my expression once, and demanded to know precisely what they had orchestrated. So I explained everything. I described the binder, the clapping, my mother's tone, my father's tranquil face, and the manner my brother gripped those documents as if raising children had magically bought him 15 years of my sweat. Marcus did not interject until I finished speaking entirely. Then he posed the singular query nobody in my household had ever offered, asking what I truly desired now rather than what they anticipated or what I could endure, but what my actual ambition was. Began responding, and almost wept before completing the thought because reality was incredibly daunting. I craved an escape. I desired my personal signature on an entity nobody could legally remove me from. I needed an enterprise structured with agreements, protocols, and equity layouts so impenetrable that no holiday banquet could possibly jeopardize it. Then the panic struck me forcefully. What if I collapsed in the open after leaving them behind? What if they mocked me, claiming I was perpetually useless without their backing? Marcus stretched over the counter, grabbed my device, passed it back unlocked, and advised me to let ruin arrive after making an attempt instead of prior to one. Right there, in that cafeteria with chili pastries on the dish and my heart still racing, I erased the former business-style shortcut from my primary screen, detached myself from the internal household text circle, and hid every communication log that conditioned me to mistake utility for affection. That microscopic action should not have felt incredibly mighty, but it certainly did. It felt akin to severing a cord right before a structure detonated. By the time the attendant replenished our mugs, was no longer discussing vengeance. I was deliberating over positioning, departure schedules, consumer devotion, and how swiftly I could reconstruct within a sector I comprehended far better than anyone sharing my bloodline ever could. That was the evening I ceased serving as their motor and transformed into my personal gateway. The following dawn I awoke prior to daylight, not because I rested peacefully, but because treachery possesses a habit of hauling you from slumber before your mind is prepared. I rested solo at my dining island in a worn black sweater, with my appearance still disheveled from the previous night, gazing at my monitor as if it represented either the dawn of my next chapter or the evidence that I had merely committed the greatest error of my professional timeline. My mobile device continuously illuminated on the wood. My father rang twice. My mother sent one message. She ordered me not to escalate the situation into a theatrical display. Then my brother delivered a brief note that somehow frustrated me worse than the rest combined. He suggested we converse whenever I finally settled my emotions. That was their terminology when an individual was looted courteously in the open and declined to grin through the ordeal. I inverted the screen downward and commenced my tasks. For 15 years, I had developed the functional nucleus of that enterprise, using my bare intellect, creating the threat mitigation networks, the server routing frameworks, the critical override codes, the data encryption protocols, and the firewall restoration blueprints when a network encountered an attack at midnight during a holiday, while everyone else panicked. Those materials resided inside databases, folders, cabinets, correspondence, and boardroom whiteboards. Indeed, but the authentic mechanism survived entirely within my brain. That was the element my relatives simply failed to comprehend. They assumed they were seizing control of a functioning corporation. What they were actually executing was an experiment to see if the exoskeleton could walk after extracting its nervous system. Regardless, I recognized I needed to remain flawlessly precise. I refused to hand them a solitary reason to label me resentful, erratic, or deceitful. Thus, I accessed every private directory, every online storage, every dormant assignment, and began dividing recollection from property, background from obligation, intuition from written records. I disabled the administrative entry points I had established on my personal equipment over the decades. I deleted former company layouts from my applications. I purged stored credentials, invoice sketches, calendar duplicates, and contractor remarks that I had drafted during my free hours purely to keep the operation functioning when nobody else grasped their duties. This was never destruction. This was strict boundary setting. It was my refusal to leave my intellectual residue everywhere so they could continuously profit from effort they had previously deemed replaceable. Nearing 9 o'clock, I brewed espresso so intense it felt aggressive and ultimately permitted myself to unfold a fresh notebook. At the header, I scribbled a single query. I asked what exactly they could confiscate and what they could not touch. The response surfaced rapidly. They could claim the suite, the position, the corporate identity, the banking access, the desks, the domain, and the fabricated generational legacy. They could embrace the fantasy of their victory, but they could never seize my comprehension of the industry, my partnerships, my credibility during crises, or the unspoken reality that most prominent buyers relied on me vastly more than they valued the logo. Once I perceived that truth plainly, the dread inside my ribs transformed. It never vanished entirely, but it altered its form completely. It ceased echoing like total devastation and began vibrating with the command to construct rapidly, construct intelligently, and construct purely. By mid-morning, I had investigated 3 potential titles, verified web address vacancies, and dialed a lawyer I respected from a regulatory clash seasons ago. By noon, I had established CipherWord Defense Systems, an entity engineered directly for what I mastered most: urgent breach containment architecture, operational resilience, and high-stakes digital threat neutralization. The title was deliberately rigid: no playful marketing, no ego, no inherited prestige, simply absolute transparency. I required the sort of moniker that resonated with premium reliability during a disaster. Next arrived the challenging phase of networking. I rejected broadcasting one of those pathetic, eagerly introducing my upcoming journey texts individuals share when they are attempting to camouflage embarrassment as evolution. That was never my style. I required no standing ovations. I needed momentum. Hence, I drafted a concise roster of 30 associates and filtered it down to 6 figures whose esteem I valued heavily enough to hazard a rejection from. I typed every digital letter personally. No generic distribution. No sentimental oversharing. Only objective truths. I had initiated an autonomous agency. I was accessible for expert consultation and immediate systemic reinforcement. And I would entertain a confidential dialogue should the necessity ever materialize. Then I rested there, palm lingering above the mouse, and sensed the gravity of the instant anchor me down. Have you ever transmitted a message that appeared less like correspondence and more like a challenge directed at your internal terror? That was exactly how it felt. I dispatched all 6, shut my eyelids, and absorbed the surrounding silence. For a brief span, the stillness was agonizing. Afterward, a feeling within my core stabilized, because regardless of what unfolded subsequently, I had executed the single action my relatives never anticipated would accomplish. I had ceased pleading for validation and began engineering myself to become fundamentally irreplaceable. The initial weeks of developing CipherWord defense systems were neither luxurious, motivating, nor theatrical. They were draining in the most profoundly unappealing manner imaginable. I passed daybreaks sketching workflow charts, middays hosting preliminary discussions, twilights refining fee structures, and midnights resting sleeplessly questioning if I had exaggerated exactly how much of my former triumph was genuinely my own doing. I operated from my flat, from my vehicle, from loaned desks in corporate lounges, and once from a hushed corridor outside a tech convention because the reception was superior there compared to the coffeehouse below. My nourishment devolved into anything consumable with a single grip, while scanning network vulnerability diagnostics. My attire shifted into a cycle of formal jackets, dark trousers, and reliable walking shoes that occupied the adjacent seat. This was not liberation quite yet. This was absolute rebuilding. However, rebuilding possesses a cadence if you endure it sufficiently long. The initial indicator that I had not obliterated my future by departing arrived on a Tuesday midday, when an executive from a continental banking syndicate phoned me personally. A massive data migration had stalled, failover servers were crashing, and nobody on their retained contractor side was inspiring any assurance. We had never collaborated autonomously prior, but he recognized me from my previous firm and delivered the sentence that altered my whole month. He mentioned hoping I was unattached because I was perpetually the sole person who genuinely resolved disasters. I mitigated the crisis in beneath 3 hours, logged every restoration phase, and transmitted an aftermath review that very dusk. The subsequent morning, he recommended me to an external colleague. Soon, a fintech startup founder rang after catching my title from someone at an investment summit. Later, a trading floor supervisor inquired if I would entertain advising on redundancy tactics for sensitive overnight transfers. It did not unfold instantaneously, but it proceeded consistently enough for me to sense the foundation beginning to solidify. Velocity in commerce is bizarre. Initially, it appears unseen, akin to shoving an immobilized truck up an incline during a blackout. Then suddenly you glance forward and comprehend it is advancing via its inherent mass. By the midpoint of the third cycle, I secured 4 live advisory partnerships, 1 fixed contract, and adequate repeating curiosity to cease acting like this was transient. I recruited a part-time security researcher. I leased a modest workspace above a bakery in Brooklyn because it was silent, functional, and precisely the type of unassuming environment I could sustain without sacrificing rest. I purchased 1 sturdy table, a pair of seats, a planning board, and an espresso maker that groaned like it was battling for survival every dawn. It was flawless. It was exclusively mine. And finally, exactly when I started sensing the initial genuine iteration of steadiness, the sector rumors regarding my relative's corporation started crystallizing into reality. Initially, it remained ambiguous. A contact noted postponed contract extensions. Another individual alluded to rapid personnel departures. Subsequently, the authentic inquiries began flooding into my mail. 1 prior patron liaison typed a greeting checking in regarding the latest management shifts. Another stated they were informed processes were undergoing reorganization and asked if I was bookable separately. I maintained my replies cautious, dignified, and utterly pristine. I never disparaged the former establishment. I lacked the necessity to do so. Their own choices were performing the communication perfectly. The most gratifying message originated from a corporate infrastructure director who had formerly acted as our most rigorous partner. Her dispatch was brief and straightforward. She bluntly admitted their faith resided in my abilities, rather than the handover, and requested to negotiate upcoming collaborations directly with me. I scanned that sentence thrice, not due to shock, but because there exists a profound, nearly visceral gratification in observing reality. Ultimately broadcast aloud what you were compelled to digest in secrecy. The business my parents had gifted to Damien was not crumbling because I hexed it, undermined it, or covertly manipulated variables from the shadows. It was collapsing because they presumed the venture consisted of resources rather than logic, contracts rather than faith, aesthetics rather than proficiency. Damien had implemented budget reductions in entirely incorrect areas. He lowered contractor screening criteria because he desired quicker profits. He terminated 2 veteran network administrators for resisting modernization when what they actually opposed was sheer foolishness. He postponed upgrades on server defense software to conserve capital. He ceased heeding the technicians who recognized which tiny vulnerabilities evolve into catastrophes in cybersecurity. Most destructively of all, he conversed with legacy buyers as if they were bonded to the household surname rather than the excellence I had invested 15 years providing. That hubris penalized them severely. Within 10 weeks, they forfeited 2 of their massive contracts. 1 migrated to a rival instantly. The second executed something significantly harsher from my relative's viewpoint. They demanded an exclusive migration dialogue with me. Just me. Not the corporation, not the directors, not the executives. Only me. That was the second I comprehensively grasped the distinction between retribution in fiction and retribution in actual existence. Fictional retaliation is deafening. It hurls glasses, crashes entryways, and degrades adversaries before massive audiences. Authentic payback is much softer. It entails the economy rectifying the falsehood the moment you step back. It features consumers' tracking capability rather than genealogy. It involves the individuals who marginalized you abruptly, realizing that what they deemed a secondary pillar was genuinely the whole foundation. My father still had not expressed regret. My mother still navigated the planet with the arrogance of someone who assumes aggression can replace intelligence. Nevertheless, the analytics were starting to unmask their incompetence. Financial strain escalated rapidly. Employee spirit plummeted. Partner faith eroded steadily. And whilst they remained occupied attempting to salvage ego, I was constructing something tighter, more lethal, impossible to hijack. The most rewarding aspect was not even witnessing their downfall. It was my personal lucidity. Every deal I executed, every endorsement I accumulated, every complication I neutralized independently reinforced that I was never fortunate to dine at their feast. They had been entirely blessed to have me designing the banquet. By the moment month 4 arrived, cipher word, defense systems no longer resembled a gesture of rebellion. It operated like a legitimate institution bearing influence, benchmarks, and a trajectory. That transition carried more significance than I predicted. During the preliminary weeks, every minor victory remained tethered to that evening at the restaurant, as though I was hauling that deception along and converting it into propulsion. Yet, somewhere amid my 5th finalized agreement, and the afternoon I definitively ceased verifying if my parents attempted reaching out, the psychological anchor shifted. I was not merely sprinting away from what they executed. I was charging toward an iteration of myself that required absolutely zero authorization from them to thrive. That was additionally when Elias Grant stepped into the picture. Elias had invested years managing compliance infrastructure for a global intelligence firm, and his standing within our field mirrored what mine had recently evolved into. Composed amid chaos, intolerant of foolishness, and entirely immune to flashy pitches that fractured beneath practical stress testing. We convened at a subdued bistro near the financial district after he messaged stating he learned I was developing something formidable. I appreciated him immediately because he squandered no minutes attempting flattery. He delivered difficult interrogations. What did my portfolio comprise? What represented my maximum load limit? How was I managing crisis overflow protocols? Did I prefer remaining a niche provider or conquering the continental market? We conversed for 90 minutes, and for the initial time and seasons, I engaged in a corporate dialogue that felt exclusively tactical, neither protective nor sentimental, nor linked to domestic reputation management. At a specific juncture, he rested his cup, locked eyes directly with mine, and offered to spare me some overthinking by stating my prior enterprise did not bleed equity because I abandoned a designation, but rather because the singular intellect comprehending its anatomy evacuated the premises. That observation lingered within my thoughts. Elias ultimately joined as an executive deployment advisor, and alongside him, my agency honed its edge rapidly. We condensed my provision tiers, streamlined billing, established a precise escalation hierarchy for urgent interventions, and began approaching massive conglomerates that would have remained inaccessible for me solo. It constituted the variety of advancement that convinces you the trauma might eventually serve as an asset. Then Damien texted. The notification struck my screen midway through a Wednesday afternoon. He asked if we could convene. He begged me not to disregard it. He claimed it was critical. I glared at the words briefly before darkening the display and returning to my outlines. 6 minutes afterward, a secondary prompt appeared. He pleaded as my brother rather than as the corporate entity. That specific phrasing aggravated me instantaneously. Humans only detach their identity from an institution whenever the institution ceases shielding their flaws. Nevertheless, intrigue remains potent, particularly when an individual who formerly appeared incredibly comfortable, robbing you abruptly projects profound insecurity. I declined to reply that afternoon, or the ensuing one. On Sunday dawn, he submitted a terminal plea. Just please. I consented to a visible location near the harbor because I harbored zero intentions of entering an isolated space alongside a person who grinned while my monumental achievements were reallocated during appetizers. Upon spotting him marching my direction, I perceived prior to his first syllable that conditions were infinitely worse than the gossip suggested. Damien remained sharply attired, persistently groomed, but the grooming felt astonishingly fragile. There exist individuals who sport designer garments in the precise manner others utilize tourniquets, strapped firmly, enough to prevent the internal hemorrhaging from becoming visible. That perfectly described him. He occupied a chair, offered a weak grin, and began by commenting on my healthy appearance. I countered, stating he appeared severely deprived of slumber. Because my exhaustion forbade me from simulating basic courtesy, for 60 seconds he attempted managing the atmosphere, speaking in ambiguous managerial jargon regarding economic friction, handover fatigue, and personnel intricacies. I permitted his rambling, since occasionally the swiftest route toward honesty involves letting a liar drain their stockpile of justifications completely. Ultimately, he reached the core issue. He confessed our father assumed the transition would flow seamlessly. He added, our mother continuously insisted. I chronically magnified the difficulty of the operations, and he foolishly absorbed that narrative. I offered zero vocal response. Quietness proves highly beneficial whenever an adversary finally begins listening to their own delusions collapsing. He continued speaking, and the structural fractures expanded drastically. They had alienated patrons. Domestic resignation rates were skyrocketing. Suppliers were posing aggressive inquiries. A primary funding channel faced suspension. A legacy director had resigned following a dispute concerning regulatory bypasses. A pair of foundational partners had demanded exit interviews due to severe anxiety regarding operational stability. Then he arrived at the actual motive behind our gathering. He implored me to return, attempting to project composure. He proposed I operate parallel to him rather than beneath him, suggesting we could rewrite the corporate hierarchy and market it as a unified executive coalition. I almost snickered, not due to humor, but because the sheer entitlement was genuinely paralyzing. Half a year prior, I was commanded to labor below him, simply because he was owed comfort. Presently, he was dangling an equal station as though it represented some magnanimous concession. I issued a firm denial. His facial muscles contracted instantly. He snapped, demanding I act rationally, and for a single heartbeat the classic Damien resurfaced, the spoiled heir who perpetually confused unearned privilege with actual talent. He argued I had formed a decent minor project, but his firm retained massive reach, active treaties, physical assets, and wealth, insisting we could rescue the sinking ship if I merely ceased acting rigidly. There, the truth sat entirely exposed, pure panic disguised as condescension. I tilted my posture forward and maintained a whisper. I clarified that I was never behaving stubbornly. I was simply behaving like an unaffordable commodity. That silenced his protests momentarily. Next, he pivoted toward an alternative angle, gentler this attempt, almost infantile in its delivery. He recalled our father claiming I was the resilient sibling, asserting I prioritized career milestones over making others feel accommodated, and insisting he required this inheritance far more than I ever could. I locked onto his eyes and posed the inquiry he had been dodging the entire duration. I questioned if that justification made it acceptable to harvest what I personally cultivated. He parted his lips and subsequently sealed them. Zero rebuttal followed. Only the inaugural flash of authentic guilt I had witnessed on his features since this entire ordeal commenced. Yet even then he remained partially deceptive. He murmured an assumption that he could eventually mature into the role. He confessed believing that once possession was granted, he would magically decipher the complexities. That exact phrase illuminated the whole puzzle. He never desired the struggle of creation. He solely yearned for the glory of the finish line. He presumed holding the deed would transmute him into a capable leader. Such alchemy is impossible. As we elevated to depart, he launched a final effort to drag me back into the domestic narrative. He questioned if this was genuinely the conclusion. He asked if I was truly prepared to spectate while their vessel submerged completely. I studied his expression for an extended moment before responding. I stated I would simply continue executing the duties they all arrogantly assumed anyone could manage. Next, I pivoted and strolled away. And while withdrawing, I continuously pondered the dilemma rooted at the core of tales resembling this one. The dispute individuals debate endlessly because a simple resolution does not exist. What exactly is owed to an entity that robbed you when they ultimately recognize your worth solely after forfeiting access to your mind? Compassion, maybe? Absolute separation, perhaps? A brutal education? Or absolutely nothing whatsoever? That query accompanied me vastly beyond the harbor, fading in my rear view because I verified one fact absolutely. Whatever materialized hereafter would never unfold upon the conditions set by figures who confused my dedication with their permanent property. 4 days following our waterside encounter, my father phoned, using his unlisted device since I blocked the primary, the household line completely. I nearly forwarded the tone to the answering service, yet a dark curiosity urged me to listen to panic once it sheds its luxurious casing and diplomatic vocabulary. He muttered my name, deploying the exact pitch he utilized whenever he needed an audience to view him as the rational party. He declared the rebellion had stretched too far. I remained entirely mute. He interpreted the gap as clearance and pressed onward. He revealed the agency was experiencing immense pressure. He confessed Damien was crumbling. He asserted our ancestral reputation was heavily jeopardized, as though our surname had ever patched a server vulnerability at dawn or guided a terrified bank executive through an audit crisis. Then he uttered the exact phrase that finalized my verdict entirely. He reminded me I knew my brother lacked the mental fortitude for this environment, unlike myself. I genuinely clamped my eyelids shut because the toxic cycle had manifested again. Not a hint of regret. Not an ounce of responsibility. Merely a fresh manipulation to weaponize my extreme competence into a familial duty. I asked softly if he had been aware of that reality all along. I summarized that they knew he was incapable of steering the ship, yet they granted him the captaincy regardless. My father paused indefinitely, which broadcasted an absolute confession. He argued the boy required a guaranteed parachute. He claimed I magically managed to survive any plummet gracefully. There exist certain combinations of syllables you memorize perfectly until your dying breath. That specific string was undeniably one. Not because it was cinematically vicious, but because it stripped naked the domestic calculus I had unknowingly occupied for decades. Bestow the agonizing labor upon the resilient son, hand the lucrative prize to the coddled favorite, and label the transaction unconditional love. He demanded I visit the headquarters. I bluntly refused. He pushed harder. I continually declined. Next, my mother commandeered the receiver and deployed the classic authoritarian frequency, the exact timbre that functioned when I was a naive youth mistaking bullying for true leadership. She commanded that I held no right to penalize our bloodlines simply because my feelings sustained an injury. She accused my behavior of being hyper-emotional. I chuckled directly into the microphone. I strongly disagreed. I clarified that my current posture was universally defined as facing natural consequences. Subsequently, I severed the connection. That exchange ought to have finalized the saga completely. Alternatively, Damien routed an email that midnight bearing a header declaring he would endure absolutely any penance required. I discarded the note. He transmitted a secondary version, the ensuing sunrise, vastly lengthier, and for the inaugural instance utterly devoid of theatrical posturing, no vocabulary concerning ancestral destiny, no endeavors to barter over job descriptions, solely grim statistics, income plummeted 40%, 3 additional departures imminent, banking privileges facing termination, consumers demanding definitive executive clarity, and a singular phrase near the signature that felt so ruthlessly stark it froze my breathing entirely. He admitted spending his entire existence harboring envy because the sector idolized me, and he allowed that bitterness to render him catastrophically foolish. That admission failed to absolve his thievery, however, it successfully forced a hesitation. Thus, I accepted a singular gathering strictly upon my conditions inside their boardroom, completely excluding the elders from the premises. As I penetrated the lobby half a year following my exodus, the architecture radiated an incredible tininess. Not spatially shrunken, but fundamentally depleted of substance. The reception guards, who formerly welcomed me with warm camaraderie, appeared paralyzed now, appearing torn between offering a formal salute or an intense apology. Damien waited within the primary meeting suite lacking binders, devoid of counsel, and stripped of any artificial bravado, only carrying a blank legal pad and possessing severely bloodshot eyes. He confirmed the parents were absent entirely. He informed them this disaster was his personal creation to swallow. That constituted the premier sensible statement I ever witnessed him formulate. I took a seat and instructed him prior to his pitch that I was absolutely avoiding a return, rejecting any title within his regime, and refusing to carry the weight of his incompetence. He bobbed his head gradually as though he had practiced enduring that specific rejection. Then he questioned if a single favor existed that I might grant. I evaluated the proposal meticulously, because this is the exact intersection where vengeance folklore historically selects destruction over genuine significance. I desired zero pointless destruction. I demanded unfiltered reality heavily attached to a brutal invoice. I suggested a possibility contingent upon one solitary mandate. He shifted his gaze upward. I demanded he produce an open broadcast hosted on the primary corporate network profiles, no marketing angles, and zero ambiguous vocabulary allowed. He must declare that the succession was butchered, that technical mastery was shunned, that employee warnings were mocked, and that I single-handedly constructed the functional core they discarded like cheap trash. He must beg forgiveness from the subordinates who attempted intervention. He must apologize to the buyers who swallowed their lies, and he must deliver this monologue entirely solo. His complexion drained of all color immediately. He whispered, asking if it must be completely public. I confirmed absolutely. He protested that our father would violently veto such an action. I challenged him to dial the man and relay my permanent refusal instead. Damien stared deeply into the mahogany for an agonizingly extended duration. I could virtually monitor the warfare raging between his ego and sheer survival. Eventually he muttered, asking if executing this would guarantee my assistance. I kept my guarantee sterile. I clarified I would never salvage the enterprise entirely, but I would audit his emergency blueprint exactly once, toss him a singular minor lead matching his degraded bandwidth, and explicitly list the structural overhauls required to avoid total bankruptcy. That was the maximum limit. He gulped heavily before nodding his surrender. He agreed faintly. At that exact second, he ceased resembling a nemesis and morphed into a mortal being violently stripped of the final illusion, shielding his incompetence. I offered zero solace. Solace was completely unnecessary. The stipulation served as the profound education itself. Extreme ownership must precede any form of rescue. Naked reality must arrive before salvation. Damien uploaded the confession roughly 2 days afterward, and when I assert the global cybersecurity circuit noticed, I mean they reacted violently and instantly. He positioned himself inside a barren office, lacking promotional backdrops, missing teleprompters, absent of parental coaching, and broadcasted what should have been admitted half a year prior. He vocalized that the leadership transfer was grossly botched. He conceded that the infrastructure and consumer loyalty upholding the agency were exclusively forged by my hands over 15 grueling years. He confessed that veteran engineers flagged impending disasters, which upper management arrogantly silenced. He issued apologies to the workforce for generating chaos and to the buyers for eroding their security completely. The delivery lacked perfection entirely. His vocal cords trembled noticeably. He appeared absolutely wretched. Excellent. Specific truths are universally designed to extract a heavy toll. My father reacted with volcanic rage. My mother labeled the stunt deeply degrading, yet degradation remained merely a discounted version of the absolute ruin they nearly orchestrated. A total institutional implosion would have proved infinitely pricier. I screened the recording a single time, transmitted a concise architectural fix document to Damien, and honored my bargain precisely as dictated. Nothing additional and nothing omitted. I connected him with a modest local credit union requiring temporary firewall reinforcement, an easily handled assignment rather than a prestigious gold mine. Afterward, I retreated into the background completely. The legacy firm endured, yet only as a fractured shadow. They permanently failed to recapture roughly half of their hemorrhaged capital. Numerous massive partners definitively refused to return. A pair of elite supervisors permanently rejected reinstatement offers. The financiers drastically amplified their regulatory chokehold. The relatives absorbed the massive distinction between blind inheritance and actual stewardship via the most agonizing route available. The former involves a mere pen stroke, while the latter demands a relentless skill set. Simultaneously cipher word. Defense systems accelerated continuously. Elias cemented his permanent partnership. Marcus assisted me in sourcing an immensely superior logistics director. Prior to the dawn of the 7th month, we secured the most colossal pact of my entire professional journey. A massive 8-figure threat containment retainer alongside an international investment bank that previously recognized me from my former tenure, but ultimately selected my independent agency because they stated executive integrity fundamentally outweighs inherited legacy architecture. I generated a physical copy of that quote, burying it inside a cabinet for days before finally deciding to mount it beautifully. Not primarily because I sought arrogance, but rather because following eras of serving as a useful ghost, it felt crucial to memorialize one transparent string of text that validated reality completely. Weeks later, I hovered outdoors adjacent to my fresh headquarters, shortly after the exterior branding was bolted down. Cipher word defense systems, sleek metallic typography, my signature, my framework, my profound gamble, my absolute triumph. Standing at the intersection of that avenue, if a person peered beyond 3 skyscrapers and through the congested vehicles, one could practically spot the vintage commercial high-rise where the ancestral firm currently hobbled along, operating on drastically minimized bandwidth. I glanced fleetingly before snapping my vision forward, permanently. That tiny gesture held astronomical importance. The obsolete iteration of my psyche would have glared endlessly, tallying damages, looping the treacherous supper sequence, evaluating whether karmic justice appeared majestic enough from afar. However, the man occupying that sidewalk that morning comprehended something infinitely grander. The most profound retaliation never involves lingering obsession. It merely requires absolute detachment, backed by undeniable receipts. Damien and I lack any warmth currently, yet we interact with a brutal transparency we previously lacked entirely. He was forced to quit demanding unfair shortcuts camouflaged as brotherly devotion. I absorbed the lesson to cease donating my formidable power to parasites who solely respected my capabilities when their survival demanded it. My father continuously wrestles with the stark reality that I refuse to return to, resurrect the household mythology. My mother persistently utilizes that tyrannical frequency occasionally, although never directed toward me ever again. They absolutely pleaded. Indeed they did. Half a year downstream, exactly as predicted, they violently begged for mercy. Yet, the specific fraction of time that altered my universe was never the frantic begging. It was the sheer act of walking away, entirely. Because that represented the exact crossroad where I grasped that bloodlines might legally hijack your designation, your suite, your chair at the boardroom, even the massive empire constructed by your bare hands. But they remain physically incapable of extracting the intellect that authored the magic unless you voluntarily surrender it. And I definitively refused. I protected it, fiercely. I honed its lethal edge. I forged a new kingdom utilizing it. That serves as the sacred doctrine buried beneath every single tale of vengeance worth broadcasting. Ultimate victory does not involve annihilating the fools who drastically underestimated your power. True victory consists of engineering an iteration of your existence they can no longer regulate, no longer rebrand, and no longer falsely claim as their own property. Therefore, permit me to pose a final inquiry before we disconnect completely. If your closest relatives successfully hijacked the harvest of 15 years of your bleeding soul, would you execute exactly what I managed? Establish unforgiving boundaries, provide severely restricted aid, and march violently forward into the unknown? Or would you simply abandon them to suffocate, fully trapped inside the catastrophic consequences they manually authored? Share your verdict in the responses below. I am profoundly eager to discover your choice.